Welcome back to Bite Size Magic. My name is Zach, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a short lecture about politics, reading the micro and the macro, understanding window theory, and much, much more. This is a talk I gave to the Portland CEDH community about a month or two ago, and we recorded it, and so I just really wanted to share it with you guys. Love to hear what you think about it. Without too much further ado, let's jump on in.
Well, first of all, thank you guys. Really appreciate everyone being here, listening to me yap about some CEDH stuff. Huge thanks to Eric for putting this all together. It was all their idea, and they just said don't fuck it up. So that's what I'm going to try and do, is not fuck it up. But so just a little bit about me. I won the 2025 Top Deck Invitational. It's kind of our version of the national championships. This year, I'm currently ranked number 4 on the Top Deck leaderboard. I run a YouTube channel called Bite Size Magic, where we focus on strategy and tactics and basically just making people better CEDH players. And then I do coaching part-time. That's kind of my little wheelhouse. I've been playing CEDH for quite a bit of time, and it's really cool to be able to bring it to something like this in a platform where I can share some knowledge that I've accumulated. I'm basically just hoping to give you guys some ideas. A lot of the things I talk about in this lecture presentation are not going to be like groundbreaking ideas, right? There's a lot of things that make sense and they flow, but the goal of this is to create frameworks for everyone so that when you go in games, you can think about things from a little bit more of a planned perspective instead of just, wheeling and dealing and shooting from the hip, which is mostly what I do. Yeah, so that's really the goal. The 4 things we're going to be talking about, we'll kind of get into soon, but they're very interconnected, and we'll go into definitions in the next slide. But each one of them is incremental, and if you don't have the previous one, it's very hard to leverage the next one. So let's just jump right on in. I'm going to go. Okay, great. So 2 big questions that a lot of CEDH games end up asking you is, when should I try and win, and how do I get my spells to resolve? There's obviously a billion questions that can be asked in games, but these are 2 that we're going to kind of focus on for today, and we're going to use these 4 principles of micro, macro, politics, and window theory to help answer those questions. Definition-wise, micro is understanding your own place in the game. So this is like saying, I have my deck, I have my plan, my turn is really sort of the micro. It's where I'm making a lot of decisions. That's where I'm executing. It's where I should be talking quite a bit, and it helps me to resolve my plan to win the game. The macro is what everyone else is doing, right? So this is saying, okay, on your turn, what spells are you casting? How are you politicking? What's your game plan? What's your deck? Politics is essentially our way of creating agency when we don't have any, or when we do, it's our way of communicating that agency to other players. So it's saying, maybe I don't have a spell that I can use to stop this person, but I can politic and negotiate that someone else stop this spell or stop this person. And then window theory is kind of a big topic, but essentially how I believe window theory, or how I would explain it, is that window theory is essentially a checklist for when to push. So with perfect information, window theory would be super simple, right? I would be able to see all of my opponent's hands, and I would say, if I have a win, I can execute that win right now. Since we don't have perfect information, we have to use window theory to kind of estimate when a good window is to push. Okay, so this is just basically how these 4 layers connect. You really have to understand your own game plan first. It's something that Kellen, Quen, or Hebrew Hercules talks about a lot, where it's like, if you don't really genuinely understand your own deck, you don't understand why every card is in your deck and its purpose, it's very hard for you to play the game. And it's often sometimes in coaching the first thing I want to talk about, especially with newer players. And it's why Turbo is such a good option. Turbo is essentially saying, we're going to condense a lot of these down, and we just want to focus on the micro. While this is not completely true, like obviously if you're playing Rogsai, you do have to communicate with the rest of the table, but when you're first learning how to play, it's really nice to have a deck that you can just pick up, say, how do I win the game? You put the pieces together and you get there. And a decent amount of Turbo games do end up going that way. So micro, again, is your plan. Macro is your opponent's plan for the game. Politics is communicating observations about the micro and the macro to shape positive or favorable outcomes. And then the window is when and how to win the game. Great. So let's start with micro. This is going to be kind of the first stage, or the first pillar that we're going to build. And again, this is saying, if you don't know your own game plan, you really can't read anyone else's. You're going to spend so much time like just looking at your hand and trying to understand what you're supposed to do that you'll miss quite a bit. I would say some of the best players in the world spend very little time looking at what they're doing because they know it down pat. They have a very clean understanding of what they're supposed to do and why they're supposed to do it. And yeah, so again, understanding the micro is really that first fundamental step in this game. So when we break down micro, we think about sort of a checklist of things that I want to take into account when I'm trying to understand this. The first thing is, what's my game plan, right? This should be relatively understood by just bringing the deck you're going to bring. You know what cards are in it, you understand how you win, you understand the pivots that you need to take to win the game, what happens if someone stops your central plan, how do you work around that, how do you remove pieces that are stopping you. And this plan is based ultimately upon mulligans, and that sort of is the beginning of the plan. And every time you draw a card, every time you see new information, that plan sort of updates in your head. The second thing we want to consider is, how close am I to winning, right? What line am I planning to take? How much mana is that going to need me to use? How many cards will I have to need? For example, a Breach line or a Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation line are very different. They have different structures for how they work, and we want to understand where we're at in the game to executing a win. Third thing is, we really want to understand what's in our hand and what's on board. And this is something, again, that is easier done when you have more practice and when you can just basically know, okay, I have a board state and I have my hand. I don't need to keep thinking and referring back to it. The more automatic the micro is, the better everything else becomes. And that's kind of where we're going with all this. The last thing that we want to consider, and this leads into the macro, is, am I ahead or behind on parity? Lots of definitions for parity. Simple one for me is my advantage state in this game similar to those of other players? An example would be, if I have one land in play and a player has a Smothering Tithe, a Rhystic Study, and a Necropotence, I'm behind on parity, right? And the percentage that I'm behind is really determinant upon the factors that I'm missing, i.e. cards and mana. And that's sort of something that we also really want to consider. Much of micro is advancing our parity to be better than other people's. And as we advance that parity to be dominant and stronger, we have a much better chance of winning the game. Okay, so like I talked about, before we're even going into competitive events, we really need to understand our deck extremely well, right? I have this picture on the side, which is the Queen's Gambit, where she's like looking at the ceiling and she sees the chess pieces moving. This is kind of where I want to be in every game. I really want to know where I'm at in the game, what my expected outcome is, and where I am on that path to getting there. I need to know why every card's in my deck. I need to understand exactly how I win and being able to articulate that. I need to understand what kinds of games I want to play, right? For example, Rogside doesn't want to play big games. It doesn't want to be in mid-range slogs with multiple draw engines and mana engines and tons of stack interaction and split-second spells flying. It wants to be in the early game where you're trying to win very fast and very consolidated. And then the last thing is super simple, around goldfish regularly in a vacuum and with context. So if you know your deck, you understand why your cards are there and what they do, you understand how you're supposed to win and what kinds of games you want to play, then you can goldfish that and sort of simulate a lot of the experience. In a vacuum means that I'm goldfishing just with my deck. I don't know what players in my pod, I don't know my seat position, I just am having a fundamental understanding of how my deck works. Context-based mulligans are those that exist within context, obviously. So Eldrazi Dev, amazing tool, highly recommended if you haven't used it yet, but you can plug in your deck list and see what seat position I'm in, what the other commanders are in the pod, what hands people kept. It essentially adds another layer of information for which you can goldfish from. So this is just kind of the beginning of the micro. The next thing that is important around this, and that I talked about earlier, is when we have an automatic micro understanding, this frees up the bandwidth, right? I'm not just staring at my hand the whole time saying, how do I win this game? Like, do I have enough mana? I feel like I'm off on my breach line. I already know. It's very simple. I know exactly what I need and where I need to go to get there. And so this lets me put my hand down, right? Which is something I try and do as much as possible, and pay attention to the macro. This is the other people's board states. This is their positions in the game. This is what's on board, stacks, pieces, engines, etc. The goal of having a very strong micro understanding is to make space for the macro, which is where, a lot of people should spend most of their time. Again, if we're thinking about it from a percentage standpoint, we spend 25% of the game on our turn, and 75% of the game takes place on other people's turns. So if we're not super tuned in to the 75% that exists, we lose so much information. And it makes the other pieces of this, politicking and windows to win, much, much more difficult. I'm not sure who did this quote, but it was a good one. It says, "The good players aren't surprised by much. They understand the goals of the other players and anticipate what they're going to do," right? So very strong players usually are not going to be like, wow, someone just won the game and I had nothing. Like, they're seeing these things coming from a while ago, and that's because they're spending so much time paying attention to the macro. Okay, so let's dive into macro. Again, micro just being our game, macro is sort of the table level or other players' view. Important questions that we want to ask in the macro is, what are my opponents doing? Where are they in that game plan? And what is the current board state? Right? This is something that's continually updating, just like the micro is updating as we draw cards and make mana. The macro is updating for everybody else, and it's difficult to keep track of, right? Because you have 3 other players, you don't know their hands, but there's a lot of information that you can assess on board. The goal of the macro is essentially just to build a real-time understanding of where the game is, kind of like that Queen's Gambit picture I had earlier. We want to essentially construct a view of a game of CEDH in our minds and know where it's beginning, where it's ending, and what our place is in it so that we can influence it into the preferred outcomes we have. So there is quite a few macro outputs. Micro and macro are very related, right? Our view of the macro is essentially just 3 other players' micro. And the thing that we can sometimes take for granted are the things that we go into the event already expecting, right? We already know what deck we're playing, we understand its goals, all that kind of stuff. But with the macro, there's going to be times when I don't know what deck's being played, or I haven't played against it before. It might be a variation of a specific deck. I need to really deeply understand the decks at my table and what their goals are. I want to keep track of the cards in my opponent's hands, right? I want to keep track of the mana available on board. Engines as well, right? Are commanders out? Any other keyboard pieces? Turn count, seat position. Has anyone tried to push yet? What interaction has already been used? Right? These are kind of a bunch of different macro factors. We'll go into each one and why each is important. But the goal of macro understanding is just to passively track these things, right? And it helps if you can write things down. I recommend this to a lot of clients who are like, oh, I cast a Pact of Negation into a Vexing Bauble. And it's like, well, if we had written it down, right, we've had a greater understanding of what's going on instead of trying to hold it all in our brains. So let's begin with this first sort of piece, which is knowing what other decks do. It's, I would say, one of the most important skills in CEDH is understanding the meta very, very comfortably. There's a lot of pilots who dedicate themselves to one deck, right? I've many friends who have picked a deck and they're sitting on that deck forever and they don't play anything else. And I think that's a skill, something that I'm really bad at. I play a ton of different decks. And partially that's because I get bored and I have ADHD, but I want to intimately understand how these decks work, what it takes to beat them, how they're trying to win, what their development looks like, what their advantage state appears to be. If I don't have a very clean understanding of the meta, it's going to be very hard for me to fight against it. So be a student of the format, understand the meta, look through deck lists. All these things are really important in sort of understanding the macro. The second thing, this is a fun piece of input or advice that you could take if it's useful for you, is I'll be at games and I'll have never played against a deck before. This happened at the Quest, Eric's amazing event, where I played against Atlas for the first time. And I'd heard all about Atlas. I was like, oh, this is a really strong player. They play Kenrith. I have never in my entire CEDH career played against a Kenrith deck that I can remember, right? And them doing something. And so I started chatting with Atlas before the game. I was like, tell me about this deck. Help me understand what it does. And they were reasonable. They told me kind of oh, we have Displacer Kit and stuff and this and that. And it's good of a player to do that and to inform you and to keep you, aware of what their game plan is. But it's also not something that should be expected. Most people that are playing more fringe decks want to keep their strategy on the down low. And that's super reasonable. You want to have that brewer's advantage. But what we can do is, number 3, ask the rest of the table. One thing we as CEDH players hear all the time is that our opponents don't have our best interests in mind. And while this is true for the most part, if we're asking about someone else's deck at the table, they do have our best interest in mind. They have every reason to tell us how that deck works. They've played against it before. This person won this way. They just want to push as much information at you as possible. And by asking the rest of the table what a deck might do that you don't understand, you get a very honest perspective. And it also starts a lot of conversations, right? Where I might hear from the Ashling player what the Kenrith does. And then Atlas is like, well, actually the Kenrith does this, this, and this. And you build a much more nuanced point of view of kind of the decks at the table and what you're playing against. So the next thing is engines. We talked about cards and mana, cards in hand, and mana available as being 2 things we want to keep track of. These are, I would say, probably the most important factors in any game of Magic as they determine what we can do. The cards are the things we spend the mana on, and the mana is how we play these cards. These are static resources for the most part, right? My number of cards in hand is not going to change. My mana is not going to change unless I have something like an engine. And I classify engines as passive and active, so this is going to make pretty good sense, I suppose, where if we look at card engines, passive engines are Rhystic Study, Esper Sentinel, Mystic Remora. Passive means that it triggers off of something that someone else does, and that is generally quite strong, right? If I have to take no action and I, net a benefit or reward from it, I want to invest as much as I can in those kinds of engines. And then we have active engines. These are things that essentially mean that I have to put something in to get something out. So Thrasios, Timna, a Ponder, a Brainstorm, a Cantrip. I am putting something in, I'm getting something out. And there's a lot of strategies that are based on these, like our Rog Thrasses and our, old Blue Farm before we were all Ristic pilled, very much focus on active engines. And active engines are generally more proactive. If I am able to put more input in, I'm going to get quite a bit more out. Which is why in kind of slow games or low resource games, as people talk about them, Ristic Study can suffer, right? If my opponents are, not casting that many spells, they're paying for Ristic Study, my engine is worse because it's dependent on other people. It's a parasitic engine. But if I'm playing, Rog Thras and we have a slow game, the only thing that matters is my input into the engine. Likewise, we have mana engines, both in passive and active form. Passive engines are things like Smothering Tithe, Tatar, the Cabbage Merchant. And active engines are things like Stormkiln Artist, Cradle plus creatures, Mana Dorks. Very similarly, I want to orient myself based on what my deck's goals are and maybe what the goals of my opponents are to understand which is more scary, right? If I am playing against a Rog Thras, for example, and they have a Ristic Study, it's not as bad as them having a Cradle plus a bunch of creatures, because their game plan is such that it's geared towards this active Thrasios Cradle engine. It's not as much geared towards a passive Ristic Study engine. Now that's very different when we look at something like a Rog Ishai, right? Because their whole goal is to accumulate as much passive engine as possible so that every game actions your opponents take will benefit you in some way and you can control the board. Okay, next thing is basically the two modes of reading the macro. Again, passive and active. Passively, I can do quite a bit by just observing, right? This is something that we're doing at all times when we play CEDH. We're looking around the board, we're seeing how many cards people have in hand, we're understanding how much mana is available, we understand who's drawn, what interaction's been used. A lot of this can happen without you saying a single word, and it's something that a lot of players do very well. A lot of players who have 60 card backgrounds only engage in this sort of passive information gathering. The active information gathering is where we start to transition towards politics. This is things that ask the table questions directly. Do we have answers for this? How close do you think this player is to winning? Can someone help me out with how this deck works? This is all active information gathering that's meant to fill in the gaps for the passive gathering that we've been doing. One thing I like to say, some people think, oh, I'm not very good at politics. I don't really know how to yap very well. And one suggestion I give is just to verbalize more of your inner thoughts, right? This is something I pretty much have to do. Like I have a very bad filter. And so if I have something pop in my head, most of the time I'm just going to kind of say it out loud. And this honestly helps quite a bit with politics because it stops having to be about like, oh, I don't want to look stupid or I don't know what to say, to if I have a question and it pops up in my head, I'm just going to ask the table, right? I really don't lose that much by doing that. And this is a good way to kind of shift into a slightly more politically heavy, skill set, is just by verbalizing more inner thoughts. It really helps with quite a bit of the active information gathering. So this is a fun one. One way to think about politics is that we're trying to get to a state in the game where I have achieved telepathy, right? This is a blue enchantment. It says your opponents play with their hands revealed. If I had telepathy, right, at all times in every CEDH game, like I talked about, it'd be very easy to understand who's winning and if I can win, and all this information essentially is readily available to me. And so the goal of the information gathering that we're doing is to kind of get to the state of telepathy. Of course, this is not ever going to be totally solved. Like I can't know exactly what card everyone has in their hands, but there's a ton of information that gets thrown around in CEDH games. People revealing their hands, showing cards, making reads, right? You cast a Vamp Tutor and someone's like, no, you're good, right? That's like one card that I just essentially got revealed by someone's hand if I think they have a mental misstep, right? We want to try to get as close as possible to achieving telepathy within our own heads. Very similar to the Queen's Gambit thing. We want to basically see more than we're actually seeing. And this information, again, is something that is the result of passive and active information gathering. Okay, so with this macro, we have essentially what I would call a live threat map. We want to establish kind of three big questions, and we want to have answers to these questions available all the time. I want to know at any moment who's the biggest threat and why, right? If I can't say that in a game, it's going to be very hard for me to politic both proactively and defensively, right? It's going to be hard for me to resolve my engines or my Ristic or my Nas if I don't even know who's the scariest person and why they're the scariest person. The second thing I want to be aware of is who has interaction and what kind of interaction is it. Again, just a form of information gathering that we're going to kind of continually develop as the game proceeds. And then the last thing is what lanes are open and closed, right? We talked about earlier how I should know how I can win, and I should know the multiple ways I can win if I get stopped. Certain cards are going to close lanes, right? If there's a Grafdigger's Cage in play, it's going to be really hard for me to breach without removing it. If there's a known Force of Will in hand, that might be something that stops the lane of like an Ad Nauseam or a Necropotence. And if there's a Curse Totem, which is apparently a Pacific Northwest special, it's going to close some of my creature lines. So I'm going to need to understand basically what's on board and what's in hand that are going to limit the way I go about winning this game. And again, all these things are things we kind of want to just have floating around in our head as a way to kind of actively assess what's going on in the game. One thing that you can do, and again, there's some information provided in handout materials, so you guys can check this out. After every turn, a simple checklist I'm going to go through is just ask myself, who just gained the most this turn, right? If we're looking at parity across all 4 players, who gained the most this turn specifically? Because oftentimes there's quite a bit of momentum in cEDH. Things don't shift like on the dot, they're gradual. I want to understand who's ahead in which realm, right? One player might have a Rhystic Study. One player might have a Smothering Tithe. One player might have a Valley Flood Caller. Those are 3 different realms of advantage, but each one player is ahead of and one player is behind it. So if I can really understand the different layers or lanes, I suppose, that I'm going to be approaching the advantage state from, this is how I want to do it. I want to have a back of my mind understanding of what interaction exists at the table, right? So if I am playing against 3 blue decks, I know that probably most of the blue counterspell suite is online at some point in the game. As the game progresses, people cast spells, people go to discard. I have an idea of what's in the graveyard. I have an idea of what's been used. I understand how many cards are in people's hands and the percentages that they have that interaction. I can understand what mana is available, right? So if all the free counterspells have been used and they're tapped out, I know that one player is probably out of interaction. And then the next thing is, what is the next threat that I want to anticipate, right? This is essentially just our way of controlling that macro so that no one else gets too far ahead in parity. And again, this is just a nice little ritual that you can do after every turn to update that macro awareness that exists.
I wanted to talk to you guys real quick about some tournaments that we're going to be going to in the very near future. We've got Breach the Bay 2. If you're the first Breach the Bay, it was a freaking massive success. One of the largest tournaments California has seen, and it was hosted by Doot Loot Association with Merlion Games. We got the same thing coming to you August 22nd and 23rd in San Mateo, California. This time, this is functioning as the Top Deck Open. So the Invitational will be taking place in the same space and hosted alongside Breach the Bay 2. If you didn't make the Invitational, you can still play in Breach the Bay and clean up a pretty tidy prize winnings. There's a $25K minimum guaranteed, so the winners will obviously have quite a bit of dough to throw around. There's going to be an artist alley as well as vending from Doot Loot, Merlion Games, and Gold Sabertooth himself. So make this one of the best events in cEDH history. Let's compete with that first Top Deck Open and beat 500 players, and I'll see you there. Some of you may remember an 11-hour game of cEDH that took place a little over a year ago. This happened in Provo, Utah, and now we're back for round 2. Although I probably can't promise an 11-hour game again, you never know. We're going to have Yaps Giving. This is going to be November 7th and 8th in Utah, Provo. If you are in the area, if you're somewhere nearby, if you're on the East Coast, if you're in Europe, come to this event. Utah is the place for cEDH. They have some of the best players and people that I've been honored to play with in this game so far. If you register before September 8th, you can claim this spot at this tournament for just $100. After that, the price will increase. So if you want to check out this event, check out Yaps Giving, links below. I'll be there playing some cEDH and seeing if we can break that 11-hour record.
Okay, so the next layer of this is politics. And again, politics is really all about agency, agency being my ability to influence the game in some way, shape, or form. And politics is great because you get to influence the game without casting spells. You don't have to use the precious resources of cards and mana. You can just talk. And how well you talk and what you talk about is very much completely dependent on the micro and the macro. And so that's why we really need to deeply understand those 2 realms before we can be adept in politicking. This lets us say what's threatening. Why is it threatening? Why is what I'm doing not threatening? Why should my things resolve, right? Politics is essentially just the communication language of cEDH. Okay, so when we talk about politics, there's quite a bit of information. There's a ton of different schools of thoughts on how to politic. I'm just going to talk about it in 2 different ways. One is defensive and one is offensive. So defensive in my book is stopping opponent's spells, stop them from getting too far ahead, whatever it might be. And then offensive is getting my own spells to resolve, putting myself into a more advantageous position. Much of politics actually is the same for defensive and offensive, just like micro and macro are very similar. It's just the frame that we kind of look at it and talk about it through that changes. All right. So let's start with defensive politics. Defensive politics, again, are about stopping my opponents from doing too much. I'm going to use the macro reads in defensive politics quite a bit because it's going to inform me as to where my opponents are in the game. I essentially am just managing parity with my defensive politics. I'm trying not to let anything too scary resolve. I'm trying to not let anyone get too far ahead. And I'm managing the rest of the players so that we either have parity or I'm ahead in parity. Our job defensively, again, is to just make sure that no one is going too far. It's okay to allow things to happen, depending on what deck you're playing, obviously. But again, we can kind of see on the scale here, behind, at parity, and ahead. We really want everyone to be in that middle zone, or we want to be slightly ahead of everyone else. Defensive politics are just how we facilitate that. So one part of defensive politics is that I think they start before mulligans. This is kind of what I was talking about before when we were saying that we want to understand what decks are at the table. So the first step of this, obviously, is what decks am I playing against, right? I want to have this understanding of, all right, there's an Atali, a Kinnan, and a Magda in my pod. This sounds like a horrible pod, by the way. I would not want to play this pod. But if I've never played against Magda before, the first thing I need to do at this table is say that, right? I need to say, hey guys, never play against Magda, don't know how the deck works, what should I be looking for, how do they win? And I need to have that understanding. And I also want the other players at the table to have that understanding, right? So one thing I'll do, especially if you're playing against like a Ral or something, is I'll just ask the table, like, have we all played against Ral? Do you guys know how this wins? Do you know why it wins the way it does? Do we know that we could just lose on turn 2? Most of the time, most players have not played against every single deck, and so there's a lot of explaining and nuance that can kind of occur. The second thing I like to do, and again, this applies slightly more to mid-range decks, just because you can be a bit more open about your plan, is talk about what your deck does, right? The goal here is not to gaslight the rest of the table and be like, scary, 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 but me, I'm not scary. It's like, we're all doing things that are powerful. But if I can state it in a very clear way, right? For example, if I'm playing a blue farm list and it's a slightly more mid-range blue farm list, I want to let the rest of the table know. I want to say that mostly I'm not mulliganing for Necro and Nas. I'm not mulliganing for quick wins. I'm trying to keep this table alive to the mid or late game. And then the last thing is giving context and not commands. One thing I try to do whenever I politic is I want to state everything as either a question or a suggestion. I almost never want to tell people what to do. And we'll kind of get into this more as we talk about politics, but the worst thing you can do in politics is make them emotional. When players get emotional, they make irrational decisions. And so we want to keep everything within the realm of rationality. We want to keep it based on arguments. We don't want to make it so that people are getting, angry or spite playing. Like, I don't want any of that in my game at all. So as much as I can, I'm going to suggest things and ask questions, not tell people what to do. So an example of how this might play out, right, is I'm sitting down, I'm playing against Atali, Magda, and Ral. I'm like, hey, have we all played against these decks before? Do you guys all know how they win? Everyone's like, yeah, I've played against these. Like, I kind of understand what's going on. You're like, great. I'm playing a blue farm list. I'm not playing a super aggressive one. I'm trying to stay alive to the mid game. So that's what I'm going to be doing. And then if I'm sitting across from these players, I might say, hey guys, just so you know, Ral and Atali probably can win on turn 2. I'm going to be looking for hands that might be able to interact with that so we don't lose. If you guys are able to, it might be a good idea to do the same. This is kind of a bad pod example for this, but again, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page, right? I don't want to get caught with my pants down because I was the only one that kept interaction, or maybe I mulled a 3, right, and I wasn't able to stop anyone, and the other decks at the table didn't know what was going on. All right, the second thing is that I want to look at interacting in the game as sort of 2 parts, right? There's casting spells and there's talking about spells. Generally, I always want to start by talking about things. I almost never want to just snap off a spell. This is not always true, right? You're going to get into very complicated and serious stacks where you can't talk about everything, right? And plays just have to be made. But instead, you do want to try and approach everything as if you can sort of have a negotiation around it to manage the parity that we've been talking about this whole time. So, for example, let's say someone puts a Necropotence on the stack. I'm not just going to slam a Force of Will. Be like, oh, Force of Will. Like, I want to ask the table and understand where we're all at. A turn 1 Necropotence in seat 1 is very different than a turn 3 Necropotence when everyone else has like a Rhystic Study out, right? These are contextual things that change the power levels of cards. Now, if we are in this position, right, where there's a turn 1 Necropotence, I'm probably going to ask the rest of the table, what are we doing, right? If I have priority, I'll talk about it. I'll say, hey, do we have any interaction for this? Yes, no. If I do have interaction, then I want to basically start that conversation, right? Do I need to use this, or can we have some sort of negotiation? I always do want to start with that, where we can say, all right, let's find out a way that you can resolve your spell. I don't have to use my piece. You can gain some sort of advantage out of this, and I don't go down anything. Sam Black talks about this a lot, where he's like, if you cast a spell and I counter it, us two players just went down 2 pieces, and the other 2 players stayed neutral, so they advance. Again, this is why multiplayer is so different from 1v1, and that's why politics is so important as well. The first thing we should be doing is talking about spells, trying to understand the floor and the ceiling of them, which is something we'll go into later. Counter spells or stopping things, removing things are kind of the backup. We don't want to always default to that. I would say that one thing you can try is, before you counter something, especially in the early game, try just talking about it a little bit, right? See if you can negotiate something that's going to be reasonable. Sometimes you don't even have to use your piece, right? Someone else will be like, I'll handle this one if you deal with the next one. Number 1, start a conversation. Number 2, interact. Okay, so this is the floor ceiling negotiation. And this is kind of how a lot of politics kind of goes at this point in time, right? You have a spell put onto the stack, and I have a counter spell, and the conversation that we have is the power level of this spell that you're going to resolve. So if we talk about the ceiling of a spell, it's the best thing that it can do, right? For an ad nauseam, for example, I'm going to cast it, I'm going to draw as many cards as I want, I'm going to try to win the game. The floor of the ad nauseam is that I draw a single card, and that's it. You got to find somewhere in the middle, right, to create negotiation and agreement such that you can keep your thing and they can keep theirs. This can also be the other way around, right? If I'm trying to resolve an ad nauseam and someone has a counterspell, I'm usually asking the question, what is reasonable for me to do here so that you don't counter this spell, right? What level of value can I gain that keeps us at parity and that keeps the game going on without me getting so far ahead or winning the game? And so what we're really trying to do, again, is negotiate within this range of the floor and the ceiling, finding something that's reasonable. A lot of things have floors and ceilings, some things don't. For example, if I cast a Thassa's Oracle, then I cast Demonic Consultation, and now we're trying to have this discussion about, well, what's a middle ground that we could live in for this Demonic Consultation? It's like, it's pretty much past, the train has left the station, right? There's not something that this Demonic Consultation is going to do aside from either win me or lose me the game. But if you, before the Thoracle resolves, have this conversation, you might be saying, hey, I have a counterspell, don't push for a win. They have their consultation, and they're like, well, I guess I'll go get a Rhystic Study or a Mystic Remora or something that keeps you in parity without just blowing you out and using my spell. But I would just say that when you're having these political conversations, try and find the middle ground between the floor and the ceiling, especially if you don't want to exhaust your interaction. Okay, so offensive politics is about resolving our own spells. One mindset that I've talked about a bit is the idea that every spell I cast can resolve if I politic it correctly, right? I can find the power level that's acceptable to the player who has the interaction such that they don't have to use it and I can get something out of this. Again, I'm really not trying to emotionally leverage the table. Whining, complaining, moaning, bitching, like these accomplish nothing. No one cares, really, if you're whining about, well, why did you counter my turn 2 Rhystic Study? Doesn't matter. But if you can approach it from a logical angle, right? I have a turn 2 Rhystic, they have a fish, this player's about to win, whatever it might be, you get a lot more done. And so when you're going about trying to get your own spells to resolve, I generally am trying to fall back on logic rather than, letting my emotions get in the way. The second part of this is oftentimes people have knee-jerk reactions, right? I'm sure everyone has been in a game where you cast a Rhystic Study on turn 1 and someone force-willed it. And they're like, it's just too strong. You can't have a turn 1 Rhystic Study. It's too powerful. And then you ask why, right? Why is this too powerful? And they're like, well, you're going to draw too many cards and you're going to win the game. And that's when you're like, okay, how about I just don't draw cards for the first turn cycle? It'll be like a turn 2 Rhystic Study. And then they're like, well, that would make me less scared, If we can address the root problem or root cause of fear, we oftentimes can get a lot more stuff to happen. So again, we're basing all of these politics based on our macro and micro reads. We're letting them know where we're in the game. We're trying to assess where everyone else is at. We're trying to give them a reason why whatever we're doing is reasonable and within the parity that the table is currently at. All right, this is retroactive YAP. This is something we talked about a little bit with like the Thassa's Oracle example. Most of the time, this is really great with tutors, right? Especially instant speed tutors, but it could be the same for like an Imperial Seal or a Gamble. For example, I cast an Enlightened Tutor on end step. I say, hey guys, I'm gonna go get a Necropotence unless someone wants to show me something that would dissuade me from doing that, right? Counterspell, whatever. And it gives me the agency to pivot between winning the game and creating an advantage state for myself. The retroactive portion of this is really important in Europe, right? Where a lot of spells, to my understanding, cannot be taken off the stack like they can in the US. In the US, I might cast a Necropotence or an Ad Nauseam. You could say, hey, I have this piece, we're going to lose the next guy. Like, can you just not cast that? And we can go back. In Europe, To my understanding, again, I don't know if this is 100% true, but if a spell's on the stack, it's on the stack. There's no takesies backsies. And so in European politics, there's quite a bit more retroactive negotiation that occurs, right? You talk about the spell in your hand. You say, hey, I have this ad nauseum. Does anyone want to show me a reason not to cast it? And then you have that conversation kind of before the spell's put on the stack. I think this is a really good practice to kind of get in the habit of, as it's going to make you basically think about what you're doing and not pigeonhole yourself into committing to one plan or another. So again, upside of this is you kind of get information before you commit to something. Again, you don't pigeonhole yourself. You can still gain some value. You don't just get totally blown out. The downside is that you do tip your hand, right? For example, I cast this in Light and Tutor on end step. Someone has a misstep that they weren't going to use, but then I say, hey, I might get a Necro, and then they use the misstep, right? And I'm not able to convince them that I'll just get a Ristic Study. Again, the interaction can hit the tutor specifically because you talked about it. This is a very fine line, but for the most part, talking about these kinds of things is almost always a net positive. I would rather lose because I talked too much rather than I didn't talk enough, which, probably is something I gotta work on. But anyway, so this is kind of going back to the interaction versus talking about things. When someone interacts with a spell of mine, that's when the conversation for me begins. It doesn't end there. So, for example, I'm gonna cast my Ristic Study, you're gonna cast a Force of Will, and instead of just being like, okay, end of conversation, I want to kind of go through some steps to try and get the spell to resolve. So these steps are acknowledge that whatever they're doing is reasonable, right? I don't want to start off by saying, that's so stupid. Why would you make such a dumb play? You're a bad player. I want to acknowledge that whatever they're doing is reasonable, right? Because it is. If they have a reason to do it, it's reasonable. And I can just affirm that by saying that. The second thing I want to do is ask why, right? This is something we talked about a little bit before, where I said that people have these knee-jerk reactions. They have, a lot of fear-based plays that occur. And oftentimes that the depth of reasoning does not go very far. It's just, this is scary. But when you ask someone why it's scary, you start to boil down the argument. And that's really where we want to live. Next, I want to present context, right? I want to use the macro or the micro understanding of where I'm at, and I want to compare it to the macro understanding of where the table's at from my point of view. Third, I really want to have openness. And again, this does not mean that every deck should do this, but it's something that is really useful, especially if you don't have a lot going on. It's just showing your hand, showing a few spells. Maybe you have 3 lands, a Thassa's Oracle, and a Consult in your hand, and you flip the 3 lands over and you're like, not in a great spot, right? I can't show my whole thing, but this is what I got going on. Again, I just want to have this openness. I want them to know that they can work with me, that I'm not someone that's going to be, annoying or like hard to talk to. I want to say like, hey, I'm being super open with you. The next thing is I kind of want to make the case for them. I want to give them the what's in it for me pitch. And usually in interaction-based things, we want to kind of go back to, are we going to lose the game? Right? So if you Force a Will on my turn 2 Ristic Study and Ral's in front of me, I might say, do you have another piece for Ral? Right? Are we just going to lose on board to this deck? And by, trying to say, this is what's in it for you, you get to keep a counterspell, you don't lose the game, this spell is not winning, or we can have some negotiation around it, it makes it much less about me, and you actually get them to think about their own place in the game, whatever that might be. And then the last thing is the floor ceiling negotiation, right? What we talked about, where if we work through this stuff and they're still like, I still think I have to counter this spell, the best thing you can do is to make it less powerful, right? You can say, all right, this Ristic Study that I got on turn 2 is not a Ristic Study. It's going to be an Esper Sentinel for a turn cycle. Or I'll only draw if you say I can draw. Or whatever it is. This is really where creativity gets to shine in these floor ceiling negotiations. There's infinite deals that you can make, and somewhere in that spectrum of infinity, you're going to find something that's reasonable to that player. Again, the sort of through line in this, and the question that I ultimately want to be asking is, what would we need to agree to for this spell to resolve? And that puts the onus on the other player to basically create an argument, right? Sometimes they're going to say, there's nothing we could agree on that's going to make this resolve. And that's where this sometimes can break down, right? Of course, I'm not going to resolve every spell I cast, but if I go into it with that mindset that I can, I think you end up resolving quite a few more than you would if you just stop the conversation as soon as someone showed a counterspell. Okay, so this is offensive politics in practice. I'll kind of walk through the example that we just talked about and sort of how it would apply to a live example. Okay, so cast my Ristic Study on turn 2, maybe turn 1. Player B casts Force of Will. I say, that's reasonable. Ristic Study is a powerful card. Why are you countering it? Right? They're going to give me their understanding, their argument. They're going to say, oh, it's too powerful this early in the game. No one has a draw engine except you. You're going to outdraw the rest of the table. Your deck is really good with Ristic Study. Maybe you're Raw-Gisha, and it's like, we just can't let you have that. And so it's like, all right, now I can understand where they're coming from. Next, I'm going to present context. I'm going to say, okay, again, very reasonable you want to counter this. Ral is coming after us, right? So If you have a plan to stop RAL and you think it's enough, then great. If you don't, this heuristic might be very useful, right? Currently, this is what my hand looks like, right? I don't have a way to deal with this next player who's probably going to present a win. My game plan is to be a mid-range deck. I'm trying to play for a long game. I'm not trying to win quickly. You get to play quite a bit more Magic, but should this heuristic study get countered, that might not be the case. Next, I'm going to ask what's in it for them, right? Again, you don't lose the game right away to RAL. That's coming directly after me. And then, should this all not work, I enter into floor ceiling negotiation. In this example, I might say, all right, you don't want this heuristic resolve, you think it's too powerful. How about I have an Esper Sentinel, right? And if someone tries to push, it'll be a heuristic study. Or how about you tell me if I can draw, right? If you think we're in a position where we're going to lose, you'll let me start drawing some cards. I can also show them every card I'm drawing, right? I'll be like, hey, here's the card I drew, here's the card I drew, here's the card I drew. Again, infinity possibilities of deals. I'm just trying to understand what is reasonable for them to let the spell resolve. Again, because we do not exist in a scenario where everyone thinks the same way we do. We really need to get onto their level. We need to understand our opponents intimately. So that's maybe how you might work through something like this in practice. So, like we talked about, defensive and offensive politics are really the same skill. They're just two faces of a coin. We're using all the same skills that we talked about before: card ceiling negotiation, macro reads, micro positioning, all the context. They're just applied in different ways, right? For defensive politics, I'm trying to make their spell less powerful so I don't have to use interaction. Offensive politics, I'm trying to make my own spell less powerful so they don't use interaction. Again, defensively, I'm emphasizing what is good about my opponent's position. I'm trying to relate it to each other. I'm trying to relate it to myself. In offensive politics, I'm trying to show basically weakness, right? I want to understate my position, not lie about it, but just basically, you can always find weakness in any or vulnerability in any game. You just have to position it in a way that it makes sense to the rest of the table. So anyways, the whole point of this is politics is really the same toolkit. You're just operating in different directions. At the end of the day, it's just how can I best communicate with these other three human beings in my pod. Okay, so these are just a few tools that you can kind of use in the toolbox of things to do when you're politicking. Again, first thing, I want to pose politics as questions or suggestions, not demands. Again, the whole goal of politics is to create conversation. It's not just me talking the whole time. It's me suggesting things, it's me asking questions. I want people to draw their own conclusions, right? So that what they're doing is based on their own reasoning. It's not based off of me telling them what to do. I want to frame my opponents when I'm working with them as a unit. I want to talk about it in we's, not I's. I don't want to complain and say, I won't be able to play this game. I'm so sad that you countered my thing. I want to say, if this resolves, we might not get another turn. I want to create sort of a teammate, I guess. I want to create a teammate in my opponent when I need them to be a teammate. Don't get emotional, right? Everyone is going to get emotional. I've been extremely emotional in games. There's a lot of tough losses, things that didn't happen the way I wanted them to happen, deals that were made that I didn't like, but I have to realize that as soon as I let my emotions get involved, I'm going to create a game that is very chaotic and very much out of my control, right? The less emotional I can get and the more reasonable I can be about the deals I make and the things I ask for, the better that I'm going to be able to achieve the outcomes I want to achieve based on logic. So if you feel like things are getting emotional in game, I would just say, try to reset the pod a little bit. Try to be like, hey guys, let's cool back down. Let's come back to a base level. We're all playing cEDH, but really keep an eye on emotions because they will tilt games in ways that are completely out of your control. It's just like letting a bull loose in a china shop. Again, politics are all about conversation. It's not about telling people what to do. The goal of every political discussion should be to initiate a conversation that ultimately ends in an outcome that you find favorable. And then the last thing is, again, what's in it for them, right? We want our opponents to understand things based on their own game. This is so much easier when you have macro reads of the table. You can say, this is where you're at in the game. This is what happens if you deal with this thing that I'm doing. And I think it might not be to the goal that you're trying to achieve. Here's something that might be good for you, right? That would help you achieve the goal and help me achieve what I'm trying to do. So really try and think about things from your opponent's position and frame them in a way that they understand why they're doing it and why it's actually good for them. And again, just some things that you can ask, right? Before you speak to the table, you want to ask yourself, based on your macro reads, what does the player want from this game, right? What's their deck? What's their outcome? What's their goal? What's their position? I want to understand how our interests align, right? So what can I do that's going to work with this player to get me to where I'm trying to go and them to where they're trying to go? Again, most things are going to happen much better if you have shared outcomes that are positive. We versus I. And then also, is my tone suggesting, demanding? Am I telling? Am I asking? I want to frame more to the questions and suggestions rather than the demanding and the telling. So yeah, those are just a few things that can help with your political tools. All right, this is the last point, which is window theory. So window is the moment when the micro and the macro align in your favor. Windows, again, are how we know that we can win the game. And it's quite a bit of factors that come into play. So there's gonna be a lot of information. Again, take whatever is useful for you from this. I'm gonna just present it in the way that I think about it. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is what decks are we playing with, right? This is coming back from our macro reads. We know that some decks have what we call natural windows. Turbo slanted decks have natural early windows. Their decks are built in such a way that they're just supposed to win the game on turn 2. Ral, Atali, Rock Size. These decks have a kind of known window where it's like, I'm trying to win the game turn 2. If I go later, I'm going to have a much worse time doing it. It's going to be way harder. Mid-range decks have kind of different windows. They can articulate in the early game or the mid-game or the late game, hence the term mid-range. Understanding the meta is going to tell you what decks are trying to operate in which windows, you know? So if I sit down at a pod and I know what decks I'm playing against, I should be able to know around when the time they're trying to win the game is. And that's part of the importance of really understanding what other decks are at the table. Okay, factor number 2 is cards, right? Just like we talked about in terms of like understanding the macro read of the table. Fewer cards or fewer answers. This is pretty simple. If all of my opponents have no cards in hand, my window is probably pretty wide open, right? There's very little that can be done to stop me from winning. I want to understand where players are at so that I can sort of track percentages. And I want to understand what interaction these players have access to, right? If I'm playing against an Atali with 30 cards in hand, that's very different than playing against a Ragashai with 30 cards in hand. Atali has a specific kind of interaction that they can use. Generally, they're not hard counter spells. And the mana they have available is also going to influence it. We'll kind of get to that later. But this is another factor when we're looking at windows, is just evaluating number of cards. Next thing is mana. Again, a lot of this is super self-explanatory, but it's good to kind of build this checklist in your head. Less mana is less defense, right? Someone may have 30 cards, but they have no mana available to them, and that limits them to free interaction. Generally, great windows occur when people are all tapped out, right? This is kind of a signal that the amount of things that could stop me are decreased by an exponentially large amount. Most decks' interaction is usually cut in half if they don't have mana to interact with, right? It's just the free spells. And if they're not in blue, it's insanely decreased. The idea that if 2 of my opponents who are in blue are tapped out and maybe the Mardu player isn't, means that for the most part, I am pretty good, right? There's a lot less things that are going to be able to hit me than if the opposite were true. The Mardu player tapped out and the blue players are untapped. I would say that mana is one of the most, or mana available is one of the most important signals I'm going to look for when a window is open. All right, just like we talked about earlier, engines change these static factors significantly, right? If I know that someone has 0 cards in hand, but they have a Rhystic Study, an Esper Sentinel, a Mystic Remora, whatever, that number of cards in hand doesn't really matter. This is also true of a deck like a Thrasios deck, right? They may have 1 or 2 cards in hand, they may be showing everyone at the table, but they have 30 mana on board, right? And that represents, I don't know, 8 cards, whatever the math works out to, but the engines are really significant factors in windows, right? If I push into people with engines, the amount of cards or mana they have available, depending on the engines, changes in an extreme way. And so we need to sometimes address engines before we try to win the game. This might look like Pyroblasting a Rhystic Study, bouncing a Smothering Tithe, right? Sometimes you have to jump through a hoop before you can execute a win. The next thing we want to consider is the board state, right? Again, this is super easy to do, where someone might see a Grafdigger's Cage in play and they forget that it exists, and they cast their Underworld Breach and everyone passes, and then they try to cast something out of their graveyard and someone's like, well, you can't, and then they lose. This has happened to me. Sure, it's happened to other people. We need to be very aware of the board state, as this is sort of the free information we're given. There's a lot of information in the game that is publicly available. Judges who are watching, I'm sorry for butchering this, but number of cards in hand, what people's board states are individually, right? I can see commanders on board for commander-specific decks like Sisay, Magda, Arkham. These are all highly impactful on the board, right? It can change my window pretty significantly. I also have to look at synergistic pieces. Thrasios with a bunch of mana and a Biomancer is an insane engine to have on board, and it's going to change the other static factors that we talked about earlier. Honestly, stacked pieces that are online mean that your window is much more narrow, or it's shifted, right? I can no longer go about my breach plan if there's a Grafdigger's Cage in play. Value creatures means that opponents really gain a lot of ground every turn, right? So that's going to accumulate and change your opportunity to win the game. So this is just another factor we want to kind of consider. The next thing we want to talk about is what turn we're on. Each stage of the game has different windows. It makes a lot of sense, right? If I am on turn 1, I know that the amount of cards my opponents have in hand is based off their mulligan. The amount of mana they have is based off their land drops for the most part. Sometimes there's engines. And the resources they have to either win the game or stop me from winning are at their most stable. As the game progresses, we kind of look at how much interaction has been exhausted. So again, another way to think about this is early game, it's really about how fast can I win. In the mid game, it's how much interaction can I push through. And then in the late game, it's who has the last few pieces, right? Who has these things like endurances, shuffle titans that put all my interaction back, split second spells, ways to recycle interaction. Each stage of the game shifts what factors matter most. Where in the early game, it's probably the most important to have a quick win. In the late game, it's the most important to have the pieces that are going to basically help you win uncounterably or in a way that circumnavigates people who have super high resource boards. So each stage of the game, like I said, has completely different windows, and we have to look at those windows and for our decks and for the other decks with those turns in mind. The next thing I want to kind of be aware of is tracking things that have resolved and have been countered, right? For example, someone casts an Ad Nauseam, I cast a Force of Will, they cast a Fierce, someone else casts a Flusterstorm, SWAT, whatever. All these things mean that pieces have hit the graveyard, we have more public available information, and if something scary does resolve, for example, a Voice of Victory resolves and the player passes turn, that's giving us a ton of information, right? It's saying, wow, there's probably not a creature counterspell at this table. So if I cast my Voice of Victory and try to win, probably going to go pretty well. But basically, this is just saying that we want to keep track of who has used interaction, who has used wins or advantage increases, things that are going to like drastically increase their parity in the game. That way, we just have basically a more active map of what's going on. Again, something that we talk about a lot in CEDH is that pushing second is very, very strong. So a good window is often one that happens directly after someone else failed to win the game. Because interaction's been exhausted, and you have generally more mana and more cards than your opponents at that stage. The last thing, again, just like what I was talking about, is to really pay attention to graveyards. I think that having a base understanding of how many counterspells a deck should run, again, this is part of the meta knowledge piece, but if I know I'm playing against this deck, they're probably on 10 to 15 pieces of interaction, maybe 5 to 6 of those are free. This is going to help immensely if I can look at the graveyards, right? I can say, oh, how many free pieces are in there, right? Is there a Flusterstorm in there? Is there an MBT in there? This is going to create a better mental image of this window, and if I'm going to have an opportunity to push through it. Again, really good players have sort of a running tally of the interaction in their head mapped against the decks they're playing against and what they believe these other decks have access to. And it's part of how this whole thing connects, right? If the micro is really well understood, the macro is well assessed, then I can use that macro understanding to really get an idea of my window and my time to push. Okay, so these are, again, just kind of the things that we want to keep on our mind when we're trying to open a window and when we're trying to win. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it accounts for quite a bit of the information that you want to be sort of assessing as you're playing your game. Again, number 1, what decks are at the table? How do they interact? How do they win? What's their windows? How many cards do my opponents have in hand? How much mana is available? What engines are in play? Are they passive? Are they active? Are they mana engines? Are they card engines? Are they going to increase these static factors of cards and mana significantly, or do something else? What's on board? What are the key board pieces? I don't need to know every single land in play unless I'm playing against Lumra, but I need to know if there's pieces in play that are going to stop my wins in a specific lane. Stacks pieces are generally the most important, but that's just kind of something that we want to keep track of as we're playing. It always sucks to play into stacks pieces and to lose to them, and it happens to everybody. I need to understand what turn we're on, right? The more turns that go by, the more my other 3 opponents have drawn cards, made land drops, played engines, right? As turns increase, the sort of texture of the game shifts very significantly, like we talked about in the early, mid, and late game. I want to understand what pushes have succeeded, what's failed, what scary things have resolved, what's been countered. This gives me a much better understanding of basically what my odds are to win the game. And then the last thing is what interaction has been used, right? Has every counterspell from these blue decks been exhausted, right? Is there nothing left? Or is there a ton left and this is totally not the right time to win? Generally, I am not going to have every single factor in alignment, right? Not everything is going to be perfect. Usually my opponents are not all going to be tapped out with no cards in hand, with no board presence, and not playing blue, right? We want to have most things going in our favor if we're going to try to win. You can see down here, the most things aligning means a window is pretty open. Few things aligning means there's somewhat of a window, but it's going to be hard to push through. And if none of these things align, right, if they're all in opposition to what your deck's trying to do, then the window is probably closed. And one thing is just being able to evaluate this and then basically when you're in game, you're going to figure out how right you were. This is all an estimation, right? None of this is for sure. We have to just estimate and guess for a lot of these things. And sometimes you're going to fail and pushes are not going to succeed. And that's just going to help you inform the next window that you try and calculate. Okay, so what about when the window isn't there, right? There's a situation where perhaps there's a lot of interaction. There's something that's going to significantly stop me, and I need to open it. Two ways that we can do this that are pretty simple. We can hard force a window open, right? So maybe there's no one's pushed yet, and everyone has heuristics in play, and there's a billion counterspells, and I need to just force open a window. These usually happen by putting things on the stack that absolutely must be answered, and sometimes can be difficult to answer. Things like silence effects, huge bombs like Hullbreaker Horror, putting your win conditions on the stack, saying here's a Thoracle, here's a breach. These are hard forcing windows open. We can also subtly open windows, and this is essentially just removing obstacles little by little. So I might Pyroblast a heuristic, might kill a value creature. I might point out someone else being threatening at the table and get the other players to use interaction or try and limit their board. When you attack engines, you attack parity, and essentially that's what we're doing throughout the whole course of a CEDH game. We're just trying to gain the highest or most amount of parity possible so that when we do try to win, it's convincing and it's backed up in the way it needs to be. Now, this little quote at the bottom is pretty gaslighty, but generally we are trying to make our opponents look more threatening than we are. This does not mean that I'm lying and I'm saying, oh, I have nothing, I have no way to win the game. But generally it's all about understating our position and accentuating our opponents in terms of how threatening or strong they are. Again, a few questions to ask before you push if you don't want to go through this whole checklist is, are the things that I've been talking about, right, these different pieces and factors, are they mostly aligned, right? If not, how can I open a window? Does it have to be hard? Do I have to cast this Grand Abolisher? Or can I try and kill a creature and start a little stack war? What happens if I push and get stopped, right? Sometimes you don't want to full commit to a push. You just want to sort of soft push and just test the waters a little bit. But if you push too hard, then you open up the window for the next player. And then the last thing is, in terms of the state of the game, right, where we are, if I pass the turn and if I don't push now, is my window going to be wider next turn or narrower? And if it just keeps getting narrower, sometimes everything is not right, but you just know that it's your last chance to go. And again, that's something we kind of have to be aware of. You have to know if this is, even if it's not a good percentage, is it going to get any better or is it just going to get worse? All right, so just to kind of recap, this framework is built up of 4 layers. The micro is this deep understanding of where you are and what you're doing in a game. That frees up bandwidth to address the micro, or the macro, which is what your opponents are doing. You build the picture of a board state. Then we go into politics, which uses micro and macro reads to essentially let you put the game in whatever position you're trying to get it to. And then the last thing is window theory, which based on these last 3, tells me when I should be in a position to win. You do need to have these 4 working together. It's very hard to kind of exist in one without the others working in tandem. So I would just encourage you guys to, when you're looking at these things, trying to make sure that you're doing good at all of them. You're not like just focusing on one thing, because you're going to get quite a bit of information left behind. One thing, if you guys remember nothing else from this, is this. Understand where you are in a game, the micro. Spend your time reading where your opponents are, the macro. Use those 2 frames to present context when politicking and when evaluating your window to win. Build the micro, the macro habits first. Politics are basically the extraction of that information. That's pretty much it. I really appreciate you guys listening, and if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to field them right now before we dive into the game.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. I think everyone's probably clapping, although they're muted.
Okay.
If you guys want to ask your questions in this particular voice chat, there's an open chat feature on it. It'll come up there, and we can maybe take some of these for 5 to 10 minutes before we start the game. So anything related to kind of the topics or pillars Zach walked through. And then if there ends up being no questions, yeah, we can just get into the game while they get that set up.
Yeah.
Couple people typing, so we'll see if anything's burning.
Thank you guys. Yeah, I appreciate it. Again, sorry if I was a little rambly. This is the first time doing like a CEDH lecture, so thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, and this will be recorded and posted probably on the Bite Size channel at some point.
Yeah. We'll get this all edited and up.
We get a question kind of from Wretched Squire, but it's really about like a lot of the these pillars pertain to decks that have agency, maybe have more of a mid-range plan. Like for decks that are more turbo, kind of advice might have.
Absolutely, yeah. So I agree. I think a lot of this presentation is based on mid-range decks. That's what I play primarily, and so that's what I feel like I can give input on. I do play turbo decks, and I have played them before. I do believe that that politics in these scenarios apply slightly less to turbo decks, just because your window is often much earlier and it's more natural, right? Mid-range is you oscillate. You're like, oh, is it now? Is it done? So when playing turbo, these factors are important, right? It just applies to a much more small scale. Right? I have to look in the first few turns of the game as to how I can go about doing what I need to do. But that being said, a lot of the politics around getting things to resolve or stopping your opponent's things are extremely valuable, right? A lot of these turbo decks are going to have things that are pushes in the early game that will get stopped. And if you can use micro and macro to say, this is where I'm at, this is where I see my opponent's at, can I get some level of value out of what I'm doing? It's going to result in a lot more favorable outcomes than you just being like, well, you counter my spell, I guess I lose, have fun, I'll watch the rest of this game. But yeah.
I think the floor ceiling, I think, is really like the thing to take away.
Yeah.
Right? Like these aggressive decks, whether it's like an Atali or even a Necro from Rogsai, it's like, all right, well, I'm going to flip Atali and, let me cast 2 of these 3.
Exactly.
Or 2 of the 4, right? Or my Necro will only draw 7 this turn and 2 every turn after that. And so you still have equity in the game versus being binarily blown out.
Totally.
Like most turbo decks are.
Yeah.
We have a question about 1v1 Magic. Like, what are learning habits from kind of 60 card or 1v1 Magic that CEDH players should think about or pick up? Because we talked about it the other way.
Yeah.
Let's think about CEDH. Think about 60 card. What do you?
Yeah. So
any thoughts there?
Honestly, I have not played a lot of 60 cards at all. I played some. Oh God, what's the format called? Pioneer, I think, in Oregon.
Oh God.
When I first started played like mono white, but I do find that when I play 60 card, I feel like I get better at CEDH because you're kind of taking away the whole negotiation part of the game. The learning habits from 1v1 that I think could be the most useful is around sequencing, right? And it's around all the passive reads that you get from your opponents instead of actively asking them questions. 60 card teaches you, and again, not speaking from a place of extreme experience, but it teaches you like, oh, what deck am I playing against, right? What are the things that they could use against me? When is a good time for me to push? But I would just say like most of 60 card is something that I want to explore more, and I know that I have some learning to do there. And I would say the biggest thing you could take away is just to go play 60 card or play like Vintage Cube, which is something I've gotten super duper into recently. And yeah, so I hope that's useful. I don't have that much 60 card experience though.
I've played a lot of 60 card, and I think, you play like Modern, for example, like the meta changes, but it's very honed. And you basically know pretty much most of the cards in all those 60 card decks. And so I think like the application of that here is like, studying up on lists. Like, Zach spoke a lot about this. If you're going to play a particular commander and they're not playing some fringe weird slot version that CEDH time made, like you should probably know 90% of the cards in that list, and then you know to play around them. Like, oh, they got Final Fortune, Born Upon a Wind, and Valley Flood Caller. If they don't have those cards, they can't win on my turn.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
And then apply that meta knowledge. Kaleidoscope kind of has a question. You travel, obviously, for events.
Yeah.
What do you find being the hardest skill to keep her adaptable at, like, encountering new metas, or like playing against fringe decks because you're playing all over the country? Like what kind of, I guess, is a guiding principle for you as you compete nationally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Hardest skill. I think the hardest thing in these different sort of metas that you encounter is obviously there's a little bit less comfort, right? If you play against the same people all the time, you're very comfortable, you know how their decks work, they know how your deck works, and traveling and going into new metas, playing against new players, is going to sort of put some training weights on you where you're going to have to learn quite a bit more than you normally would be used to doing. So I would say, like, if I'm traveling and if I'm going to new metas, the biggest thing I want to do is to engage with people on a human level before that game starts. I want them to know that I'm reasonable, I'm someone that can be worked with, and I want to ask a lot of questions, right? Like when I came to the PNW and played against Atlas, I asked quite a few questions that game. I really needed to understand how Kenrith worked, how it won, what its advantage state looked like. And I think the more questions that you're comfortable asking and go about asking, the better that game is going to go for you. The more you talk before the game starts, the better read you get of the other players at the table. You understand how good they are, how new they may be, how comprehensive their knowledge is of CEDH, and that's what I really try and focus on, is that initial conversation with everyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty good advice. We have another question around, it's a big topic, I have a whole lecture on this.
Yeah.
But CEDH deal making.
Yeah.
So I think there's like kind of two aspects being questioned upon in the Q&A here. It's one is like what is reasonable deal makings, maybe in terms of duration of deal or binary types of deal. And then I think another topic, second follow-on topic, is kind of like spirit of the deal versus letter of the deal, which is a big topic in our format, as you know. So to answer that first one, how do you go about offering making equitable deals, and I'll just give you when I play Mayhem Devil Blue Farm.
Yeah.
Rog Thras never wants to let it resolve, right?
Yep.
And I often have to go to, all right, you're immune to my Mayhem Devil in totality.
Yeah.
Which really can backfire 4 turns later, So maybe, my own learning would be like, all right, maybe it's 2 turns, 2 turn cycles. They probably won't agree to that.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's like the floor ceiling of the deal aspect, not just of getting stuff to resolve. So
totally. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So the question, if a deal is made, how long is it reasonable to expect a deal to last, or should that be laid out specifically when making the deal? So I think deals, the best way you can make deals is being extremely concise and also highly specific. And that's hard to do, right? If you're making a deal, you're kind of just coming up with it on the fly. And the best thing you can do is to put time bounds on that deal. How long is this Ristic study going to be in S%? How long is this Bowmaster pack going to last? Do I have a condition built in where if you do try to win, I have an out, right? Where it's like, oh, you tell me when I can draw, except if you're trying to win. I did this super recently in Colorado where I had a Ranger captain, there was a known Force of Will, or pact, and I was like, I will only crack this if you say I can crack this, or if you're pushing. That was the deal that was made. We get to that player's turn. They cast a Final Fortune. I'm like, so you're pushing? I'm going to crack this Ranger captain? They're like, yeah, I'm pushing right now. I crack the Ranger captain, we have a whole fight. So I would say that deals should essentially, I would always put time bounds on a deal. And then if you think that a deal needs to be amended, I'd make a very honest, statement there where you're like, hey, I feel like this deal is no longer super applicable. Can we revisit the terms of it, right? To make something that's more reasonable at this point in the game. Things have significantly developed. And then as for spirit of the deal versus letter of the law, is there a default option to default to when evaluating micro versus macro, like when deals or discussions start? So from my understanding of the question, it's do I make deals based on spirit of the deal or letter of the deal? Most of the time, I'm making spirit of the deal negotiations. And again, this is something I'm working on as a player where I often trust people at their word and based on mutual understanding. And I've got quite a bit where people are like, oh, you said I'm not pushing this turn, but I cast Final Fortune and I push next turn. And that's just going to inform me in terms of how I interact with that player going forward, right? If we have another game, I'm going to know that I got the last time, so I'm going to have to be more specific with my deal. Or something that a player, Zeke, does, really good Rog Thras player, is they'll begin the deal by saying, do we need to have a spirit of the deal or letter of the deal conversation here, right? Do we both understand what we're talking about, or do I need to lay out the terms super concretely for you so that we can make something that we both agree to and we both uphold? So let me know if that kind of answered your question, Exedius.
No, that's a good way of going about it, and getting that confirmation.
Yeah.
The CEDH time asks, do you lean, we talked about your mid-range experience, obviously success on Blue Farm at the Top Deck Invitational last year. Mm-hmm. Played a lot of stuff Ral in the Quest's Redemption events. Yeah. It doesn't fit into that mid-range, but yeah. Because you play in so many different metas, is mid-range something maybe that you're drawn to because it kind of has edge? Or is it more about mid-range for your win rate versus your success? Why mid-range?
Yeah. So mid-range for me feels like the most open way of skill expression, right? I think when you play Turbo, partially why this talk didn't really maybe suit Turbo is because it's really hard to have these sorts of deals. It's hard for me to show my hand when I'm playing Turbo. It's hard for me to make limiting ceiling floor discussions when I'm playing Turbo. Most of the things that happen when you play Turbo don't exist within the full sphere of cEDH gameplay, right? A lot of Turbo decks you're basically goldfishing your deck with other people in the pod. Ral is very much like that, right? Where when you play Ral, you just have to win the game, and there's not as much politicking that goes into winning. Mid-range, though, it's each game feels very different for me, and I feel like I get to express one of my strongest qualities in the game, which is talking, to its fullest extent. I can make much more creative and much more unlimited deals than I could if I was playing a deck whose natural window closes on turn 2. Right? I get a lot more equity to say, hey, I won't win the game this turn, I'll give you another turn, or whatever it might be, such that I can come out of this game not with a draw, but with something that is going to be a win eventually. So I hope that kind of made sense for why I tend to play mid-range.
I think it does. I think also piling Turbo just taps into people's anecdotes, they've lost a Rog size so many times on turn 1 or turn 2, so even out the gate, just by commander selection, you've lost some leverage possibly. Totally. I felt that way with Blue Farm for a while, but I think Blue Farm has fallen off a little bit.
Yeah.
So people aren't as mad at it,
Yeah.
So you get some equity here.
Totally.
We'll take 1 or 2 more questions if there's any, and then we'll get into the game. Again, just a slight mention, and we'll talk about this more. I think in the community Discord. But we're trying to rebrand the Patreon to do more stuff like this, like
It's
have
so
Zach
awesome.
and other creators share their knowledge and engage and just have a good time here.
Yeah.
Real quick, I wanted to share a word from our sponsors for this episode, Gilded Goblet. If you're in need of proxies, Gilded Goblet is the place to go. This is a brand that I just co-launched, and I'm so pumped to be able to bring it to you. We offer custom decks, so you can pick the 100 cards that you want with the art you love. We also offer singles, sets, and pre-constructed cEDH decks if you're just browsing. Every order, no matter how small it is, has free shipping, no order minimums, just grab whatever you need and you'll get it ASAP. As a tournament grinder, the quality is top-notch, and these can be used in all proxy-friendly events. You can use code BITESIZE to get 10% off whenever you shop. Also, every Wednesday at 10:30, when we release a new Bite-Size video, Gilded Goblet will run an additional sale, so just keep that in mind whenever you're shopping. You can check the link in the description and go get yourself some proxies. All right, let's get back to the video. Reach out to me if you're interested in cEDH coaching. I won last year's invitational, and I'm currently ranked top 5 on the leaderboard this year. I've been working with coaching clients on one-to-one personalized plans where we diagnose what they're working on, their struggles, their goals, and help them reach them. In addition, we're also doing spell table coaching sessions so that we can watch you play and give you direct feedback on your game. If you're interested in coaching, reach out to me on Discord. It's at bitesize_snack, or leave a comment on this video. We'll reach out to you. Huge thanks to all the patrons of Bite-Sized. You guys are the best. You help us make videos that we wouldn't make otherwise. You're contributing to the channel, and you're part of the direction of Bite-Sized Magic. Especially big thanks to our Jumbo patrons, Candy Diabetes, Nick Ray, and Sharticus. You guys are awesome. If anyone is interested in joining the Patreon, you can check it out at the link below. Helps us support us just a little bit more, and you get a bunch of really cool perks, so go check that out.